The History, Arts, and Science Action Network is a 501c3 that bridges the arts, humanities, and science to provide a highly interdisciplinary approach to the preservation of cultural heritage throughout the world. By teaming up with local storytellers, filmmakers, traditional artisans, and community elders, our field team ensures that remote and underserved communities in crisis are provided with a global platform to reclaim their personal narrative and showcase their heritage. Cultural preservation begins with cultural celebration. To find out more and learn how you too can support cultural preservation around the world, come visit us at HassanWorldwide.org.
When we bury our deceased, it does not now mean that they're there for an eternity. And that's what people think when they have funerals and they spend a lot of money on caskets and they take and bury their people. It may be there 50 years, maybe 75 or 100. But if that cemetery is abandoned, or if the developers feel that they want that property, they can get that property through hook and crook. And that's what I'm very concerned about.
It isn't just one person that did this. It's so many hands that touched this that could have taken this in a different direction, and they did not. So everybody first needs to acknowledge the wrongdoing, and so that we can move forward and do something to honor these people.
Memorialization gives a person or a family a place to grieve or to think about their family's tradition. And just having a name, certainly over the interment spot or part of a cenotaph, for instance, like all the guys who went in on D-Day, is a place to remember. So I think having that place to remember is the point of memorialization, because it's a focus rather than just sitting around the dinner table and saying, what about Granddad? Well, you know, have a nice feature and there's Granddad's name.
It's incredibly important. You know, we as a people traditionally respect and revere the dead. And part of that respect is to give them a fitting place to rest. And the headstone is it signifies that place to rest, and everybody should have that. And we're determined to see that these stones get where they should be for those families.
To really understand this story, you have to kind of understand it's a story of two cemeteries. You had the original Columbian Harmony Cemetery, which was on Rhode Island Avenue in DC. And in 1960, that was sold. As it is told, the bodies from that cemetery were removed and reinterred in Maryland at another location, which is called New Harmony Cemetery. The bodies were moved, the stones remained. So, I mean, the big question that always remains is, how did all of these massive granite, marble tombstones end up in the Potomac River?
But again, not just here. I think it's happened around the country with cemeteries of people of color. They get forgotten about the headstones, and developer walks in and takes, you know, the stones are mowed over, and then there's a big box store on top of it. So it's a shame that it happened, and I'm glad someone is doing something to bring it to life.
A lot of the problems that we have in the black community is that when the people who die off, who are related to the people who are buried in the cemetery tends to get neglected. That's when we need more African American historical societies, African American historical clubs, African American historical preservation boards. We need one in every, as many of them as we can get in every place there are, that this is their job. Stuff like this, that it doesn't matter how many people die off who are related to the people in the ground, there's always going to be, there's an organization that's standing back and watching and saying, okay, well, if you neglect that, we're stepping in, but it's not going to be neglected. That's not just for cemeteries, but that's for historic buildings and communities.
In the early 1800s, there were massive amounts of freedmen beginning to get manumitted, and they were congregating in Georgetown amongst other locations. And so in 1825, using a schoolhouse that taught both African Americans and European Americans in Georgetown called the Lancaster School, they met to form the society in 1825. Columbian Harmony Society, founded in 1825, still exists today. And 3 years later, they made it into a cemetery. But after 1865, the pressure to expand was greater. The DC government prohibited burials in the town, so they had to push out further. And they found a spot up by Rhode Island Avenue, outside the city limits, and that's where they stayed for about 100 years. The taxes would come in, so once the money stopped in the 1940s, almost no more burials, then it's just the taxes coming in, $4,000 a year, just endlessly coming in. Where am I going to come up with that money? So the year is now 1960, and the leader of the cemetery, Stanton Wormley Sr., they're in dire straits. For 20 years, they've been trying to get a bailout. They're trying to get somebody to help them. They're trying to get sales. They're trying to buy new places. Nothing was working for them. They sought people to buy it. Nobody would buy it. And then all of a sudden, they're approached by Louis Bell, whose business is to bail out African American cemeteries. And he comes with a deal that they couldn't resist. He was going to give them $400,000 cash. 100 years of battling all the time financially, finally, there would be nothing to worry about in Mr. Bell's presentation. And he would make the cemetery beautiful, a national monument. So this was a deal that the society and Stanton Wormley could not resist.
The agreement was that all of the people who were buried here were to be reinterred at the New Harmony Cemetery in Prince George's County. It's become clear from what people witnessed later, and even a recent survey that was done here, that a lot of those coffins were not actually moved out of here. So people who kind of live in the area and witnessed the metro construction, and then some other construction that was being done later in the 80s, I think during both of those periods there were being human remains were unearthed, and like coffin remains, and a quote in the newspaper of somebody saying they were putting bones in boxes the size of tissue boxes. Well, I'll just say they all ended up in like a mass grave at New Harmony with one section dedicated to the people that had been here, but they were not individually reinterred or individually named even once they were reinterred there.
My grandmother was in the old Harmony, and I think she was one of those 37,000 that were taken over to what I'm calling the New Harmony. They say that when it was time for them to do something with those remains, they notified the family, but I don't think they notified us, because had they notified us, we would have a grave marker for my grandmother. So I think they just took her with the rest over to the New Harmony.
I visited it with my mother when my infant brother died. And my mother would go there grieving for him and take me with her for I would say a year or so after his death. My mother told me that she got some kind of a notice that they were being moved somewhere, and she never remembered anything else about it. And the next thing she knew, they were developing that site into shopping centers then, as far as I know. It's been the great grief of my whole life. That there's no grief greater than that. But to me, it was driving me crazy. And every September 30th, which is his death day, I would get distressed and walk the streets and where can I go? And finally, when I learned where Harmony was, it was under the Brookland Metro. So sometimes I would just take a ride down to the Brookland Metro and just sit there and grieve for him, sitting there in the metro station.
There's another story, though, of Duke Ellington, who, you know, Washington really embraces him, but he apparently, his parents were also buried here, and he had left. I think he lived in New York by this time and got the notice that, like, you know, he had some very limited amount of time to get him out of here if he didn't want them bulldozed. And you know, his biographer has written that he said that he felt like the city disinherited him at that time.
Mr. Bell is a shrewd businessman, as he had done this at Payne Cemetery. He'd done this in other cemeteries. He was going to get rid of all those stones.
But it's really such a terrible thing. They said that some of the grave markers were still strewn around a tree in the area of the Home Depot where they did the construction and everything for the what's over there now.
So the stones, there was no requirement. The agreement that was made did not require the stones to be moved or preserved, and so the man that bought this site, Lewis Bell, apparently put an ad in the paper making the stones available, I think for free, for anybody that that might want them for riprap, which is like what I guess the kind of stones you use for erosion control.
And it just happened that on this shore here, on the Potomac River, just down half a mile that way, the property owner took Mr. Bell up on his offer of free riprap. And he carted all those stones down here to attempt to protect this shoreline with stones. And that's the sad end for so many stones that are put with such love. Perhaps the largest purchase ever made by many of those families to honor those who took the first steps of freedom in this country, and now there was nothing but a field.
Well, what happened was, how it all started was looking information about my great-grandmother, and her name was Vietta Reeves Sims. The people who adopted my great-grandmother in the 1900s, 1800s rather, adopted her. They are from D.C., and they're buried in Harmony. His name is George Johnson Beans. 1898, he died and was buried in Harmony, and that's why I went there to the new one to see where he's buried, but there's no headstone there. Yeah. So I was told that when they just moved the body, they just sort of heaved them in. And some of them, they don't know who's in which grave. Well, I think it's part of a larger history. I think that it speaks to not just the soul of D.C. at the time, but a soul of the United States. You have this, what's considered a sacred ground that was desecrated, stones knocked over. The city at one time, I think, used to park its trucks there. And then they just uprooted the graves and moved them out, you know, sort of, as I understand it, helter-skelter sort of way out to Maryland.
The gentleman that bought this place, I guess he bought it from my family probably during the Depression. And apparently when they built the metro station, they said they were going to move the graves, and folks agreed with that from what I'm told, but they didn't. They apparently just bulldozed everything. I don't know about the bodies, and I hope that they were moved where they should have been moved, because we've certainly not seen any of those here. But they just bulldozed the headstones, and then apparently they offered them in the newspaper as free riprap. And so the gentleman that bought this place got truckloads of them and brought them down. They staged them on one place on the farm, and then as they could, they essentially used them as riprap. And you know, we've got 2 miles of shoreline here on the Potomac River, so it's a lot. We think there could be a lot of them here.
There may be a way to find that contract and get more information about what happened and how is it that these headstones did not get moved. They were hauled up the river by somebody and treated like trash.
Those families owned those stones. they were nobody's. They were not to be taken by anybody who did not purchase them, or somebody who was not a descendant of the individual who that stone belonged to. Those stones were family property. So those stones were stolen, and I think I was told it took over 30 truckloads or something like that to move those stones. So it was deliberate. I mean, that is egregious racism. You know, that someone thought that they would steal someone who they felt was less dead. Someone who was less dead because they were just regular old black folk. So, you know, some people consider them as being less dead. Take their stuff, their family's belongings, and say, well, I'm going to use this to protect my shoreline because my property is worth more than your family's memory or your legacy. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to, I mean, that is the most, that is egregious.
Like Harmony Cemetery, the entire neighborhood had become redlined. It means they were no longer even selling to African Americans. They were trying to move them out, and then there was this one cemetery there, so the landowners around the cemetery, they wanted Mr. Bell to succeed. They were putting pressure there. So unheard of laws were rewritten. Never before. Each disinterment was required a judge's application. So for the first time in DC history, it was just a blanket statement. Disinter all 37,000 bodies. And so Mr. Bell would do this at the Rosewood Cemetery. He would do this at the Payne Cemetery. He would do this at the Woodlawn Cemetery. So he was just going successively through these cemeteries, paying them a pittance, getting a huge payoff from the developers and from whoever might want to purchase that expensive prime real estate. And in return, he had this 175-acre farm at that time in the middle of nowhere, where he would then rebury these bodies and help the cemetery out of their problem, which was they couldn't make their taxes. So they got their $400,000 payoff, the bodies are all interred, and what he would not emphasize was the fact that all the monuments and mausoleums would be destroyed. But he told a federal judge under oath that this new cemetery would be a national monument for African Americans. And that's how he attempted to, you could imagine, making the sale to all these cemeteries. I'm going to make it the most beautiful cemetery in the land.
It's characteristic of other African American cemeteries in Washington and really across the United States.
So metro planning began in the 1960s, and Lewis Bell, who had purchased the cemetery, then sold it for $3.5 million to the city, for the metro construction.
Development has taken over, and it continues to take over with total disregard, in some cases, for the fact that cemeteries are there and buildings are built on top of them. It's totally disconcerting to those of us who are concerned about cemeteries, about our ancestors who deserve to be interred for a lifetime.
We had bought the place and really bought it without looking it over, to be honest. And it just sort of, that's the way it evolved. And so after we bought it, we were walking along the shoreline one day. I can't remember what time of year it was, but it was probably in the fall. It was a little bit cooler. And we're walking along, and all of a sudden, we literally both saw them at the same time. And Lisa said, "Is that?" And I said, "A headstone." And we saw one, and we saw another, and there was a big knot of them right there. And so we climbed down, we looked at them, we started trying to figure it out. Lisa got very upset. I felt kind of more sick in my stomach when I saw them, because I just didn't understand why people's headstones would be on the shore of the river.
Even though some of the newspaper articles alluded that something went wrong, but it didn't go into the details that we found out once we discovered those stones that had washed up in Virginia. So from that, and then I was still amazed at the number of stones that it was.
I first contacted the Virginia Outdoors Foundation, and they came out, they took some pictures, got some documentation of what we saw, and then they started doing research. and they determined that these were stones from the Harmony Cemetery in D.C. from when they essentially bulldozed the cemetery and built a metro station there. And so from there, we've just been on a journey to get these stones back, or not really back, but get them to where they belong, where they should be, rather than being on the river shore.
We became involved in this project in a number of ways. First off, we're making a documentary, which you're watching right now. We did extensive interviews with a lot of the descendants. We have several descendant-led task forces. One of the biggest responsibilities was digitally transcribing all of the names from the original index from Columbian Harmony Cemetery. So that is digitally available right now, which is really important because a lot of the descendants we spoke with, they had to go to such challenges to kind of find the names and the dates. And now that that's available just at a keystroke away, I think was a major accomplishment.
This book is the Columbian Harmony Cemetery records that was compiled by Paul Sluby in the year 1993. Well, I spent a total of 40 years researching my family. The majority of them were interred in Harmony Cemetery. So basically my next search was for the cemetery records, but somehow I was able to come in possession of all 7 volumes of the book. They begin with the date of death. They give you information about the person that's buried. Gives you a location of the plot numbers. And for me, because the cemetery was no longer there, where I could not in person go and pray over my family's graves, these records are the only tangible part of them that I have.
And what I'm most passionate about was actually removing these stones from the Potomac River. So we went down there initially and did a visual survey, to see what was there. And close to 60 stones could be identified by the naked eye. And we returned with the team, working with Senator Stewart and his family, working with Parks, and we had quite a few volunteers who came out, and we pulled those stones out of the river. And something you'll never forget is everyone working together, and these, especially the granite stones, they look like they were made yesterday, and they might be from like 1940. But I mean, it's like the weather didn't affect them. They were just almost preserved, in that sand and mud. But these things are, hundreds of pounds. So once we were able to get them out, we also had to use some machines, and then our ground team cleaned them off and put them on display. And then we contacted the descendants of everyone we could find and said, hey, we've found some stones in the river that belong to your family.
I was able to find a couple of books with the history of Reverend Wiseman and his son are actually in there. He was an immigrant, was born in St. Thomas, immigrated to Brooklyn, New York. He was a giant in the community. If you do any research and look at old African-American newspapers, you can find everything from the laying of the cornerstone of the church to events being held in his name, led his church until the 1940s, until he passed away. I went out to New Harmony. I had found a record that talked about one of my ancestors being out there, and on a whim, went out to New Harmony just to see what markers there were, to see if I could get names, dates, more information to help build out my research. And I got out there and it was just open grass, open field, no cross, no marker, no name, no nothing. So when I was contacted by the project that there was a headstone recovered, I think I didn't even realize in my mind that headstones had even existed for them at any point. When the Wiseman headstone was recovered, It had 3 names I didn't even know about. So in one way, it was a surprise. It kind of breaks your heart to know that they'd spent the money, they, had lost these children, they had memorialized them, and to know that all of that had been discarded. And at the same time, you connect back to, here's a name that made it all its way to me, from that generation to myself. So extremely powerful.
Ellen Waters was my great-great-grandmother. Ellen Waters was the first one in the family to be buried at Harmony Cemetery. She was born enslaved. She was sold to Virginia away from her family and walked to Brandon, Mississippi. While she was in Mississippi as an enslaved woman, she had 3 children. The oldest one was my great-great-grandmother, and my great-great-aunt Amanda and her brother Edward. By 1888, according to research, my great-great-aunt Amanda, Ellen Waters, her mother, and her younger brother were found in Washington, D.C. They had been reacquainted. She was back with her family after decades of not being with them. So there's a lot of joviality and happiness. And she passed away at age 52 in 1894. My great-great-aunt Amanda married James Bailey in 1890. He worked as a porter and a doorman at Woodworth and Loafer department store. And Amanda was a dressmaker. They pulled their money together and purchased a home at 1222 12th Street in 1898. In 1910, they had a 20-year big anniversary party, and some of the gifts they obtained at that time are still in the family. My mother moved to Washington, D.C. sometime in the early 1930s and lived with her great-great-aunt and great-great-uncle. We have, therefore, 3 ancestors who were buried at Harmony: Amanda and James, and also Ellen. And I'm so happy that this project is going on so that the headstone, I know, is being revised, updated, refinished, and it will be placed back in its rightful place in the new cemetery, and then I can again go back and visit my ancestors.
Well, Delta Sigma Theta is an international sorority of professional women. We were founded in 1913 on the campus of Howard University. We have about 300,000 members of the organization. Now, one of the gravestones that were floating down the Potomac River belonged to the second national president of Delta Sigma Theta, who was also a charter member of our chapter, and her name was Dorothy Pelham Beckley. Her stone has been discovered, and of course we know the family, and so hopefully the family will do whatever it wants to do, but she is also in that mass grave.
My grandmother, my great-grandmother, great-grandfather, their children, all of them were buried at Harmony Cemetery, the old Harmony Cemetery. The earliest one I think I have is from 1909. And of course the latest one would be close to when they closed. So I nicely took my records over to the new Harmony in hopes of finding out where they were so that I could honor them and I could go back and share this information with my siblings to let them know we need to have some kind of ceremony. Do you know their grandmother and great-grand, all of them are over there. I was so excited. So I went over to New Harmony and I took my records, and the young lady that took the information from me, she was so helpful. She said, well, it's going to take me a while, but I will bring you back and I'll tell you, where they're located. So she did. She brought me back my records and she told me the exact locations of where they were. But then she quietly said to me, but there are no headstones. And I said, no headstone. So I'm just mumbling this to myself as I'm leaving the building to go and ride around to the different locations that she gave me. And sure enough, I saw no headstone. I barely could even read the little number and lot number and site number that they have down on the ground. So I became so upset that I got in my car. I had to sit there and collect my thoughts. And I just cried because I said to myself, I said, nobody had enough money to get a headstone? That's what I thought. I didn't think that it was something done in a different way. I just thought we just didn't. And then I would think about my great-grandfather. I said, well, he was a contractor. He owned his first home in 1882. He owned a second home in like 1928. He helped start the school of North Brentwood. This was somebody that I certainly would think he would have been honored and have a gravestone.
My connection with Columbian Harmony Cemetery is through my great-grandfather, Professor William Hart. He is entered in that cemetery. When I was growing up, I didn't know as a kid that Professor Hart was buried there until I started learning more about him as I got into my teen years. As the years passed, I came to understand that he didn't have a headstone. And so I purchased one for him. And I always thought that maybe Professor Hart couldn't afford a headstone. And that seemed kind of weird to me because he was an attorney, a little while with the Department of Agriculture, Assistant Librarian of Congress. And so he was earning a living. And so it seemed a little strange that there would not be a headstone, but I accepted it. Through Hassan, who contacted me about this effort to restore harmony, to pull that stone out of the mud, out of the water of the Potomac River. It would be bliss for me. It would deliver to me an instant connection to my ancestor, who I have felt connected to just by reading about him.
So it would be interesting to find the history of that person and that tomb, that stone, because it's important that if you died away from your family, that somebody was able to take care of your remains, your bones, and ship them back to China so that your family and your associations can do the rites that are part of that, your faith in China and traditions and to your ancestors. And maybe that's a linkage to the stone you're looking through. Maybe that person was reburied and then the stone was discarded, so it wasn't relevant anymore. I've been in many cemeteries, like rural cemeteries, old Chinese cemeteries, and find stones that are laying around that they're using it to mark the border of places.
A death certificate, or you may have a memory of that person. When you look at that grave and you see that headstone, that's the true physical evidence that this person existed, he lived, and we cared about him, people loved him. And you didn't have that. I didn't have that at that time, I think I had at least 20 relatives that were buried in Harmony, and nobody had a headstone.
I think so that all the stones that are here could be taken to an area where the families can mourn and have closure. I think it's very important. But I think to have one area to remember all of those who are missing their headstones for their families to mourn and grieve.
And so those stones, after that point, we had those stones moved from Senator Stewart's property to New Harmony Cemetery, where they are to this day.
Behind us, or on the other side of the road here, we have about 12 acres that we can dedicate to a proposed memorial that will commemorate the names of the families that were moved from the old Columbian Harmony Cemetery to the new Harmony Cemetery, and have a nice feature of some type that also illustrates that movement from one park to the other. But it's just proposed, and it's rather expensive, but hopefully we'll find the funding to do what needs to be done. Well, I think it's very important that we proceed with this project. And I think that the families in this area will see more and more value in it, you know, as it comes to be. I want to see it happen. I think it deserves to happen.
How many stones are left? Once again, we were able to pull out close to 60 fairly large stones from the Potomac River. But once again, these were what we were able to see with our naked eye. To figure out what else is there, we would have to either use a ground-penetrating radar, a LiDAR drone, or side-scan sonar to see actually what's beneath the surface. I believe there's thousands, if not tens of thousands, stones that are still just out of sight. But our team, the History, Arts, and Science Action Network team, you call us tomorrow and say we can come back to Senator Stewart's property and remove more stones, and there's a way to do it, we will be there.
So initially, the cemetery was cemetery society members who were buried there. And these were some of the most famous residents of Washington, D.C. William Slade, who ran the White House, Medal of Honor winners like Christian Fleetwood, the Douglas sons, both of Frederick Douglass's sons, Charles, William Kexley, the dressmaker for Mrs. Lincoln, she was buried there. So the only survivor of the Harper's Ferry incident, Perry Osborne, he was buried there. So, you know, it's a kind of a who's who of the area from the 1840s, you know, through 1920. They were all buried there. And so this was the cemetery for the most prestigious cemetery in Washington, perhaps the nation, to be buried in.
You know, D.C. had a wealth of knowledge of black people in science and music, arts, and I think, you know, the military, you know, and I think this cemetery and getting to know who's in there and history is helpful.
Harmony is so important. It doesn't matter what stature in life you were, and let's face it, Harmony was a premier cemetery, and it had wonderful people of high stature and prominence and what have you, but it also had everyday people there.
I'm just so pleased to have been involved in this project because, as I see it, it's restorative justice. There have been so many remains moved from cemetery to cemetery without families having any knowledge about it. And families are looking for relatives because we're in the search for our kinfolk, our ancestors. And some of them will never be found because they don't know where to go.
It couldn't happen today, but in 1960, Washington, D.C., it happened. And Home Rule came 5 years too late. Mr. Bell attacked Woodlawn. He was stopped. In 1965, a lawsuit came against him. Even though he owned the cemetery, he had approval to disinter, he was stopped because nobody in this country would allow that to happen to their loved ones if they had any way to stop it. And similarly, Mount Zion Cemetery in Georgetown, same thing. After 1965, they were stopped from another disinterment there. So by 5 years, Harmony was destroyed. 5 years later, the country would not have accepted this.
I just want everybody to get that recognition and that honor, no matter who their family member was. And I want people to know about them. And that's the gift that I feel that I can give to my children and grandchildren and children to come.
Once again, there's a lot of bits of history, and we say, oh, wow, that's a shame. We should really do something about that. And a lot of times when you say that's a shame, you need to realize that perhaps you're the person to take action. You're the person who needs to get in the water, dig your hands in the mud, and wrestle that piece of history out from the abyss and bring it back to the surface.
I think the biggest thing for me for that project, again, personally, is I selfishly would like to see more of my family's stones come out, because it just brings them back to life for me. Yeah.